Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Paul Curry. I am the manager of the Urban Systems Unit at ICLEI Africa, and I'm very excited to be guiding us through a conversation on localizing the Sustainable Development Agenda in African cities. And I'm joined, as you can see, by a number of esteemed colleagues who are going to share their reflections from their contexts. And before I hand over to them, I'd like to thank very much the Sustainability Summit organizers, as well as Cape Media, for the opportunity to convene this session today. So this session is a follow-on from some conversations which began last year as part of RISE Africa and as part of ICLEI Africa's interest in supporting cities to implement the Sustainable Development Goals at local level. And the central basis for the conversations have been that we have entered the decade of action for achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and that local governments and cities are vital to effectively implementing and achieving these goals. And I think at this stage in the sustainable development journey, we've arrived at a point where most people acknowledge the importance of cities, particularly as they are the concentrators of people, as they use most of our resources, emit the largest proportions of greenhouse gases, or are responsible for them due to their consumption, but also because of the immense opportunity that they have in terms of concentrating industries, ideas, opportunities, and innovation. So we've arrived at a point where we acknowledge the importance of cities, but how do we really localize the SDG agenda in cities and support city officials and members of the public and civil society and businesses to take the agenda forward themselves. So as part of last year's discussions, ICLEI proposed 5 tips for SDG localization. And these are effectively to see the bigger picture, to align your existing efforts with the SDGs, to not reinvent the wheel, to go back to the basics and see how the SDGs are relevant in your context, to stay on track by creating roadmaps and frameworks and empowering champions to lead the implementation, and then of course to review the progress and change direction if needed. Some of the key remarks made by many of the provocateurs joining me today from last sessions were that we need multi-level governance and multi-stakeholder engagement, and that is absolutely required for effective implementation of the SDGs. And for this, we need strengthened awareness of sustainability and to really demonstrate that it is everyone's role. Partnerships are vital, as it's not simply a local government prerogative to lead sustainability, and that everyone has a different type of role that is important. Co-production of knowledge can really strengthen these partnerships and actually improve the uptake of evidence for guiding decisions and for using data effectively. Finally, using the SDGs as a basis or a reference point for urban strategies and frameworks can make that connection quite effectively. So we've already had a bit of discussion in our pre-prep behind the scenes about the session, and some of the themes emerging is how do we budget effectively or finance our sustainability activities, how do we invest in data collection, and most importantly, what does our current context in a global pandemic with many national lockdowns mean for how we intend to recover and center the SDGs as a way to do so. So with that, I'm very excited to introduce our panel today. We're going to start with Puvendra Akia, who's the Senior Manager of IDPs at eThekwini Metro Municipality. We'll then hear from Dr. Michael Oloko, who is the Deputy Director for Scientific Research at the Mistra Urban Futures Kisumu Local Interaction Platform. We'll then hear from Sharon Govender, who is the Projects Manager for Environmental Planning at the City of Umhlatuzi, and then from Moses Kwashi, who is the Chief Investment and Business Development Officer in Accra Metropolitan Assembly. We will then welcome our esteemed colleague Diteboho Makele, who is the Program Manager for Sustainable and Resilient Cities at the South African Cities Network, who will guide us through a conversation. So again, I'll ask our intervenants to keep their first inputs relatively direct so that we can have a rich conversation afterwards. So thank you, everyone. And Puvendra, would love to hear your reflections from eThekwini.
Good morning. Thank you, Paul, for the introductions. Yeah, it is really part 2 of our journey, which we started last year. I've really changed my sort of presentation around the contextualization of localizing the SDGs. It's really looking at some of the measures that we at eThekwini have taken in terms of a post-COVID sort of recovery. So therefore, my sort of inputs are really around recovery and some of the interventions that local government actually needs to make to actually recover from our pandemic. COVID-19 has made it extremely difficult to mobilize the sort of resources needed for the achievement of the sustainable goals. The current rate of progress on the SDGs in African cities is actually insufficient to meet our 2030 targets. Given these difficulties, as well as the new challenges presented by the pandemic, African cities should should reconsider how these sustainable goals are actually embedded in the policies, but also the implementation needs to fully recognize the context where we actually find ourselves in. And we actually have to redirect many of our efforts in terms of fighting the crisis at hand. We note that there's significant overlap in terms of the SDGs and the AU agenda for 2063. And the AU agenda probably is more realistic from a timeframe perspective. However, given the current lockdowns as well as the low growth rates, and we find it increasingly more difficult to address both the AU agenda or even the SDGs itself. However, in saying that, as African cities, we always found a way to face the adversity and show resilience in terms of the challenges imposed on us. As we lead to the 9 years towards the 2030 timeframe, there's significant sort of emphasis placed on post-COVID recovery plans. So I will basically go through some of those recovery plans that talk directly to the SDGs. Now, colleagues, I deliberately left out the references or linkages to the SDGs so as to create an understanding that the implementation measures should not be pigeonholed to a specific indicator or target. One of our biggest challenges that we face in cities is we do not look at the interrelatedness or the interdependence of each of the goals. It's for this reason that in my writing up of the notes, I've taken out all of the sort of linkages to the SDGs. So the examples that I put forward, I do confirm that they are embedded and grounded in policy, strategy, and implementation framework that talks directly to the SDGs. There's no doubt about it. We have to look at a short, medium, and long-term perspective in terms of post-recovery and recovery around the COVID. But today, I'll literally talk about the short-term measures that we are looking at in eThekwini itself. So firstly, there's an urgent need to review intergovernmental relations, and we all already spoke about that. That leads to co-created plans. In the South African context, we've embarked on the district development model that does provide some hope for a single co-created plan that talks to budgeting and implementation. Fortunately, eThekwini is one of the pilots. It's still early days to see the fruits of that labor in terms of the interaction around the DDM or the development of the DDM, the district development model. But it does hold some positive truths in terms of intergovernmental co-creation plans itself. Building on the district development model, the coordination of public sector expenditure has become more critical now to ensure that we deliver services. So if you're looking at methods to arrest the spread of COVID, and water and access to water being one of the critical infrastructure, by coordinating across various spheres of government, we've been able to actually assist in providing at least basic level of services to majority of our residents and our citizens itself. One of the positives that actually come out of the impact of COVID is that water and sanitation SDG, we've seen a significant investment in terms of the provisions across the municipal sphere itself. There's always an issue around funding and having to look at budgets itself. Repurposing of grant and grant funding rules will assist in a far bigger synergistic effect on development as opposed to a narrow focused sector specific funding itself. Having a funding regime that talks to transversal approach to implementation bodes very well for the SDGs as well as service delivery within the municipalities itself, because we start to talk about the interrelatedness of the goals, but also objectives across the municipalities itself. We need to look at our internal processes. Slow decision-making in development approvals have severely affected development and investment in our cities. We need to urgently resolve around red tape issues in cities without compromising our sustainable development principles. Moving to an online planning application system has assisted the municipality in processing applications, even during the highest lockdown levels itself. It ensures that we provide levels of services, but also embeds the principles of being a smart city, but also embracing the fourth industrial revolution. The current low interest rates mean that there's an upswell in the property markets on two fronts. One from the sale and purchase of property, and the second is on renovation. Cities would need to be in tune with the property markets to ensure that development is actually supported and stimulated itself. One of the provisions that we're looking at is a 12-month development application fee holiday that actually supports and promotes the encouragement of landowners to develop the property. However, we need to ensure that it's done in a sustainable manner itself. For me, one of the critical issues is that how do we build social cohesion, but also civic pride as well. We come from a very divided society, a very divided community, and during stressful times like the pandemic, economic recession, and growing inequalities, this puts additional pressure on those that have and those that do not. Now, social cohesion programs, unfortunately, have largely been put on hold because of the lockdown regulations or restrictions. The municipality would need to actually look at innovative ways to engage with our citizens. One of the key programs that we're looking at is how do we focus on volunteers and a volunteer campaign and a program within the city to actually build civic pride, which also assists in building social cohesion in the city itself. The buy local and support local campaign is also one that is supportive of building social cohesion. So how do we support our local neighborhood stores, our farmers markets, and assist in building social cohesion itself. We need to arrest spiraling and rampant unemployment in the cities. Attempts have been made to refocus and reprioritize our budgets, more to look at upscaling of our youth, as well as looking at skills development program itself. At this stage, I really do want to make and stress a point, is that there is a dire need for cities to advocate or actively support for youth development in agriculture. Unfortunately, agriculture is not seen as a viable employment opportunity for youth, and we need to target youth in agriculture. So we started a program where we look at targeted youth messages and communication related to costs, profit delivering, as well as the opportunities that agriculture offers ourselves. As cities, we do not have any hope in ending poverty as well as hunger without access to good quality, nutritious food in the quantities that is required, but also at a price that makes it accessible to all citizens. Social safety nets is also an opportunity that cities need to take advantage of. Unfortunately, most cities look at social safety as a food parcel or possibly a voucher system. The city has taken a step further in that how we've addressed homelessness in the city is an example of a social safety net that we provide. The setting up of homeless reception centers coupled with skills training, economic activities, health system, safe drinking water, drug rehabilitation, and exposure to employment opportunities allow for better integration of homeless people into society itself. Some of the successes have actually shown us where some of the substance abusers who were homeless have actually been rehabilitated through this program. In some cases, some families were reunited with each other. We've also created opportunities and employment opportunities through a food garden that is supported by neighboring hotels and restaurants itself. Whilst we're promoting employment, we need to ensure that we actively support the restart of business or the startup of businesses itself. We've established a one-stop center and hotline, but this is a collaborative approach with all spheres of government. And I think it's not just an equity-driven process, it's actually an all-of-government process, where we provide real-time advice to business owners and business startups itself. The center also includes organizations that deal with funding, so it's your banks, your SETAs, but also insurance facility and insurance claim facilities as well. I think allied to this, the city is looking at targeted specific sector recovery information. And I think this is actually critical as well, is whilst we try to provide support across the board, there are certain industries that actually require specific recovery information. So be it your tourism sector, your chemical sector, your textile sector, etc., there needs to be targeted sort of interventions for these areas itself. Now, colleague, it would be remiss for me not to talk about the next point, which is the relationship between public space and good mental health. I'm a public space advocate, and I'm not going to take up or lose the opportunity not to speak about this. Because some of the mental health results coming through has revealed or highlighted very stark realities as to how fragile our citizens and even our colleagues can actually be during this pandemic. Data emanating out of the US indicate that anxiety and depression has increased from 11% in 2020 to 41% in 2021. 42% of essential workers have some form of anxiety or depression during the pandemic. But more alarming, 22% of this group actually had thoughts of suicide. Now let's take a step back, colleagues. The essential workers that I'm talking about could be one of our very own colleagues. Our health workers, our nurses, police officers, even local government officials itself. Now, one of the most effective solutions that often inexpensive and tangible solutions that can be provided and delivered at local government level is access to public space itself. There is a correlation between good mental health and physical health and the access to public space itself. Colleagues, my initial work around the SDGs actually began with public space, and I still believe that public space can provide city with the catalyst to rebuild and recover itself. So from a public space...
One minute left, please.
I'm almost finishing. From a public-based perspective, I would continue to advocate for continued investment in public space funding, inclusive and equitable spaces, but also having the ability to access public space across all demographics itself. So a few closing remarks. So how do we use the impact of the pandemic to deliver better planned and designed cities, but also address inequalities from a spatial perspective itself? Whilst the pandemic may have slowed down our progress towards achieving the SDGs, it has also provided us with an opportunity to revisit how we operate. We need to relook at what are some of the quick wins that can be derived. However, in doing so, we need to ensure that these quick wins are in the form of sustainable development opportunities, and we do not foreclose any environmental gains that can be realized later on. The success in implementing the recovery plan that is just, sustainable, and equitable lay in the ability of how agile cities can be. The resilience needs agility, and the current pandemic has forced cities to be innovative, think and operate outside the box, assume more responsibility over and above the current delivery mandates, but still continue to deliver in a very constrained environment. Speed, agility, and responsiveness are the key ingredients for a successful recovery from the pandemic. So colleagues, that's my input for this morning. I hope that I've given you some food for thought so that we can actually make an active contribution to the recovery post the pandemic and also addressing the SDGs. Just a quick tail piece from the examples I've listed, how many of the 169 targets were actually being addressed. Maybe that's a little bit of homework that I would leave for you. Thank you, Paul, for the opportunity, and great chatting to you again.
Thank you, Purvendra. I think you provided an excellent provocation for us to begin our conversation in. And I like your metaphor of ingredients into this conversation, but also ingredients into our mix and our recipe for achieving sustainable development. So these again are speed, agility, and responsiveness amidst the many excellent cases that you've shared. Perhaps before the end of our session, you can give us our answer to your question of how many targets we've touched. But I think for now, let's turn to another context and hear from Dr. Michael Oloko about Kisumu's experience in SDG localization as well. Welcome.
Thank you so much for giving me yet another opportunity to present the Kisumu's situation as far as localization of SDGs is concerned. First and foremost, I would want to say that my approach would rather be methodological, presenting the approaches that would enable us fast track the implementation and the localization of the SDGs, more particularly at the city level. So having been part of the Ministry of Urban Features network, which has been there working on urban sustainability for the last 10 years, since 2011, we've gained a lot of experience with respect to the efforts of various cities as they deal with their specific situation. I want to say that we started by looking at specific local problems in the various cities up to 2015. And as we were approaching and the adoption of the SDGs in 2016, we realized that issues were becoming more global, and it was important that we change our approach. Then we moved to looking at issues comparatively with respect to what was happening in various cities across the continent. And in this case, we had a lot of experience, and one of the specific projects that I'm making reference to was the implementation of the SDGs, which started well before the adoption of the SDGs in 2016. And in 2015, therefore, we looked at the feasibilities and the relevance of some of these targets and indicators to the cities that we were dealing with. Kisumu was included, Gothenburg, Cape Town, Malmo, and Shimla. And we noted that there were different approaches within these cities, and this was very, very interesting for us because we were able to identify various practices in these cities as they approach the implementation of this global agenda. And in so doing, we noted that we identified certain good practices in certain countries, and we were able to have a forum of interaction, and this emerged as a city peer-to-peer learning, and this we have discussed quite a lot as a good practice that is coming out from the approach that Ministry of Urban Features and Kisumu Local Interaction Platform has worked with for over a decade. And this is a transdisciplinary knowledge co-production, where the approach is working with the community and the relevant stakeholders together to identify specific areas, critical areas that are affecting the community at the local level. Then at the comparative level, we noted what was happening across the various cities. And this, we were able to deal with the SDGs very well. And we've had a lot of publications and recommendations, findings in this, in this regard. And therefore, going back to the specific questions and the pandemic that we are experiencing at this time, and we had it towards the last end of our co-production process, we had also to engage with this global issue that is COVID-19. I must say that COVID-19 tested our systems in various cities and proved that we have not been efficient in terms of resilience to deal with such serious pandemics. And we realized that cities were adopting different approaches here and there. Some could be emerged as good practices, etc., etc. But what we noted that issues of inequality were also experienced in various sectors. For example, changing the educational system, going online with facilities that students and parents in certain communities could not afford. This only left the rich to move to the next level and leaving the poor behind, which is not in line with the SDG vision. And even in the health sectors, we were thrown off board because we noted that even our insurance system was not able to take care of us during this pandemic. The planning departments were also thrown off because they had to review their processes and address the serious pandemic issues. And this, in a way, delayed the implementation and threatening the achievement of all the SDGs by 2030, because we had to refocus our processes and activities in terms of even the budget, so that we address issues of the pandemic. And therefore, noting that this is a global issue at that particular time, and I'll just give a reference to one of the articles that we did jointly across the various cities on this particular issue. And therefore, I would just say that to deal with such an issue, I would give a recommendation that there is need to develop some comparative, collaborative city networks for Africa, designed to use knowledge co-production approaches to generate knowledge and allow city-to-city peer learning on the basis of identified best practices, because this would enable us to bring cities who face the same challenges together to address some of the issues that affect them, and then identify some of the best practices to work on and get them adapted to various situations. And one thing I would also note about the knowledge co-production process is the importance of working on a neutral space, which is not influenced by any influence or policies of any institutions. And this now, we found it very important, and a possibility of leading this process is to make is to use the academic-led process. So I can refer to this as academic-led knowledge co-production process that, in a way, can try to present this neutral space and having it interconnected at various levels, as we had the Mr. Urban Futures model, where we had an international platform which is able to interact with international issues like the SDGs and the pandemic at the global level, and then connected to the local level, local city levels. And that makes it also transform these issues to become relevant to the local situation. Because what we also noted in one of our approaches before the adoption of the SDGs, that is in 2015, is that the cities are only able to work with the SDGs as long as they remain relevant to their planning processes and policies. Otherwise, they might not find this relevant. And that now takes me to the second area of mainstreaming the SDGs into our embedding or mainstreaming the SDGs into the local policies. I want to also say that this also came out very strongly when we had interaction across the cities, and we had to, in as much as every city was talking about mainstreaming of these processes into the local development plans and policies, we noted that in terms of the approaches that were used. Incidentally, Kisumu came up strongly in terms of the processes that they use in mainstreaming the SDGs. First and foremost, we noted a strong guidance from the national level, from the national level that was cascaded down to the local county level. Noting the fact that in as much as SDGs are global, their implementation processes brings a lot of benefits to the local situation.
And therefore, 2 minutes left, please, Michael. Thank you.
Thank you. So let me. So thank you so much. So I would just go straight to the specific areas that makes this relevant. So the Kenyan case of mainstreaming the SDGs into the city development plans were noted as good practices, presenting appropriate instruments and approaches as we had it within the co-production process. In Kisumu and in Kenya in general, having rather than coming up with new institutions and tools for SDGs implementation, Kenya demonstrated, hence Kisumu, how this can be anchored on the processes on familiar and legally recognized functional instruments and tools with activity targets, budget lines, and reporting lines. In this process also, responsibilities were also taken up by already existing and recognized institutions with specific roles that were cascaded from the national level to the city or the local level. So then my recommendation is the adoption is trying to look at the approaches we use in various cities in mainstreaming these processes and embedding them in into the local policies. This is very, very important. And I would say that bringing up the Kenyan situation gives us very good examples on how we can approach the issues that are affecting us and enable us to fast track this process as we approach 2030. Thank you. I have to terminate my discussion, but more questions probably I will respond. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael. We're looking forward to discussing some of these methodologies in more detail after the initial inputs. But I think you've summarized really well that point of connecting and hanging the SDG targets and approaches on existing and recognizable processes in cities. And I think that's a really interesting hook to take this forward. To reflect on some of the lessons and ideas in City of Mhlathuze, I'm going to welcome Sharon Govender to provide our next reflection.
Thank you, Paul, and greetings, fellow panelists. Well, colleagues, I'm going to disrupt the flow a little bit. And what I decided to do is just put together a few slides to guide my discussion. Am I able to share my screen?
Can we ask our host to enable screen sharing, please?
You should be able to if you see the green share screen button next to chat.
All right, I'm now able to share my screen, colleagues.
It says it's coming online soon.
All right, colleagues, I'm going to revert back to Plan B. That's all right.
Okay.
In any case, yeah, I think in the interest of time, we should just proceed. Look, colleagues, I think sharing perspectives from an intermediary city that we are offers unique propositions from what you've heard from my colleague Puvendra from Metropolitan, because of the way we are organized. We are smaller, we have opportunities for growth and the possibilities to do things a bit differently in the development discourse. And in that respect, secondary cities offer unique possibilities for institutionalizing and localizing the SDGs. Now, the City of Mhlathuze's SDGs localization process actually commenced with its climate action work. All right, the municipality has not been spared from the impacts of climate change, being affected by droughts, flooding, changes in biodiversity. And we found that these were starting to impact on the local economy, whether it's at an industrial scale or from a livelihoods perspective. And hence the municipality has had to lead or respond in a way that coordinates action from various stakeholders in a multi-level governance framework. This has been achieved mainly through its climate change action plan. And a pivotal pillar of the climate action plan is actually the importance of partnerships. And just to reflect on a critical partnership that we found to be instrumental has been the Mhlathuze Water Stewardship Partnership. And what it's done is collaborate action through various organized groups. So it's industry, ordinary civilians, government agencies. And what it did at a time where we needed action is avoid this blame game that we often see when we often reach a crisis. And the Mhlathuze Water Stewardship Partnership rallied partners together as to how we could scale up climate action. And we found that through investment from industry players, we were better able to track what's happening in the urban periphery, in informal settlements where there were impacts on water resources. And so through the use of a drone, we were able to, for example, track encroachments into riverine areas, illegal dumping. And so that's been an important lesson to share. We've also been able to track illegal water connections through monitoring the growth of these peri-urban settlements within these riverine and flood-prone areas. So that's all we've been able to achieve that through this collaborative framework of the Mhlathuze Water Stewardship Partnership. And it was through that ambit that we then realized that climate action cannot be meaningful if we don't bring in different levers and work within a broader umbrella of the SDGs. Because we found opportunities in the green economy, in the biodiversity economy, through decentralized ways of even energy transitions, that we can achieve this through tracking it through a broader framework, and the SDGs exactly provided that blueprint. So that's been our journey. We've also seen, since our last discussion, Paul, we've seen a resurgence of civil society groups championing climate action. And there've been few, by the way, that have been initiated as a result of being unemployed and through the COVID-19 experience, where civil society partnerships, grassroots partnerships, found impetus in cleaning their open spaces and riverine areas, and finding linkages which previously weren't there through food security. And we've seen useful demonstration work as well through organic farming using waste, municipal waste. We've seen the benefits there from utilizing less water. And so this resilience logic has shone through that example of organic farming. And what better way to achieve that or to implement that in a human settlements project where it's needed most. All right. And so what we've also found with that organic project is throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, these 65 households have had access to food security. They've had access to markets in selling their products. And so there's this cohesive spirit that was built from a project that started off with different intentions. And that's the message or take-home shot here that I'd like to leave. That sometimes, as government players, we often need to take leadership or to exploit our context more often and take lessons from grassroots learnings and then start to embed that into our policies. Now, in the course of all this demonstration work, we've started to integrate that work into COVID-19 recovery plans, into our green building guidelines, into our greenhouse gas inventory and aligning that with the nationally determined contributions. But we constantly battle to integrate top-down, bottom-up approaches. And I think as cities, we have to play that intermediary role in localizing policies that are imposed upon civilians. And this is where I think the co-creation of knowledge comes about, because in our instance, we've shown that grassroots movements do have credible experiences and lessons to share. And what's then left to the cities is to ensure that it's not utopia. We ensure that the work being done translates into meaningful economic opportunities. And we've already started to do that with some of these recycling projects and linking them up with the Coca-Colas. Fortunately for Mhlathuze, we have an industrial development zone here, and we could so easily convert the space into a bottle manufacturing region. And so with discussions through organized business, the Coca-Colas and other bottle manufacturing companies, we realize that that leadership is actually essential, because it's that leadership that actually influences the plans of organized industries and business. But that synergy between business and local and civil society groups, we found to be increasingly important, and government needs to plug in where necessary. Thank you. I'll leave it. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks, Sharon, very much for adding some further ingredients to our conversation. And I think here the local government as an intermediary between national or large business players and grassroots movements and small business players in the city, I think is incredibly valuable, as well as then reinforcing that point of integrating the SDGs in existing processes. And climate is such a great way in to thinking about systems, because every aspect of our cities is connected to climate action, either in reducing greenhouse gases or in improving resilience to climate impacts. So our final input comes from West Africa in Accra. So I'd like to welcome Moses to reflect on what Accra Metropolitan Assembly is doing around the SDG work. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Paul. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all our listeners. It's a pleasure to be back and discussing SDGs, because SDGs had provided us as a country, as a city, and as a global community with a very unique development paradigm that had helped us to develop in very strategic pattern. I have to say that Accra's journey into SDG began with the Millennium Development Goals. That helped Accra to make substantial gains into reducing mortality, improving education, improving access to water, improving access to health facilities. Then we transition into SDGs. And earlier on, we just recognized that SDG provided a very broad-based approach to development. As a result of that, a lot of efforts were made into how to implement that agenda in our local, policies. First thing that we did is to align the SDG goals with our medium-term development plans so that they can find specific budget targets within the city's budget.
Thank you very much, Paul, and thank you so much to all the panelists for those insights, for those lessons that can be shared with other cities. But what I'd like to now focus on is some of the challenges that you've experienced, because we learn from sharing our challenges and how we've overcome them. So a lot of the cities talked about institutionalizing and embedding the SDGs in their development plans, in the way operations are carried out in the cities. What have been some of the challenges in terms of institutionalizing and bringing everyone on board with embedding SDGs at a practical level in each of the cities? Perhaps, Shireen, if you can give us some of the highlights from Umhlatuzi, what have been the challenges in institutionalizing the SDGs?
Well, indeed, being in municipalities, in as much as they come with opportunities with localizing the SDGs, is met with constraints, and that emanates from a perspective of there being so many competing priorities of local governments. All right, and so I guess what is required is greater collaboration. That often, and particularly in the global South, we do have progressive policies guiding, the institutionalization process, whether it's from a climate change perspective or an economic recovery perspective or the SDGs. Those blueprints are there. But what's often lacking is multi-level governance. And for somebody to actually take that coordinating role. And we found that often it's to have national governments driving that is seen as, another top-down approach. It loses impetus. And that's where cities become imperative, because we somehow bridge the gap between, well, even from a global level, from a global, national, subnational level, cities somehow bridge the gap to ordinary civilians, because we're seeing a new politics emerging, and I'm using politics in a different context here, where ordinary civilians are starting to put pressure on governments to be more ambitious. And so I believe that it's at that level where cities plug that gap in bridging the gap from national policy to what it means to an ordinary civilian.
Thank you for that perspective and those insights, and really cities as champions for localizing the SDGs, as we're seeing across the world, and in our context on the African continent, it's even more imperative for cities to play that championship role and that intermediary role. Thank you so much. Michael, in the cities that you've done some research what have been the common themes that have emerged around the successes of institutionalizing the SDGs? Has there been a common theme around a specific champion, somebody who's really pushing the agenda, or is it around coordination in terms of bringing in the different role players together? Or what can you tell us about the commonalities across these different, very disparate cities that you've worked across?
Thank you so much, Letuboho, for the questions that you've asked. I would want to say that various cities were coming out as champions in various areas. Others were coming out as bringing out good practices in terms of governance and coordination of various stakeholders, horizontally and vertically, because we noted that the multi-level collaboration was very, very important. We noted that even government institutions were not coordinating vertically. So this is something that was very, very crucial. And given the different mandates of various institutions, then the city was left unable to engage with certain SDG targets and even indicators simply because of lack of data. And we also noted lack of staff in certain cities, and also issues that could be connected to political cycles. For example, in Kenya, the devolution, each and every election period, there is a really high staff turnover at the city level, more so if the regime changes. So this creates loss of memory and even consolidation of some of this information. So this, and then movement of staff, lack of staff. This is why we're also suggesting how the researchers can come on board to bridge this gap. Lack of data was also very, very important. We noted that some data was available and we could deal with specific indicators and even targets directly. We realized that data was available, but they needed some adjustments, some kind of analysis so that they can remain relevant to the SDGs. We noted that in certain instances, there was total lack of data, but there was no mechanisms to have this in place, to have the data collected so that we are able to effectively engage with the SDGs. Also, what we noted is in as much as we could come up with a good framework, mainstreaming the SDGs into the policies and development plans, there was weaknesses in the monitoring and evaluation tools. And this we noted from one of the cities that we were dealing with had an external monitoring and evaluation mechanism that was not embedded within the government institutions. So this would enable the city to actually present the implementation processes in a more accurate manner, rather than using the same staff and institution to do evaluation and monitoring of their own work. Yeah. So lack of budget line was also was cutting across, and this was very serious. And in certain areas, we realized that there is each and every city need to prioritize critical areas. In Kenya, we have the Big Four agenda that cuts across issues of food security, health issues, housing, and this enables inclining the budget lines towards the direction of priority. And this is very good and can enable, can provide budget lines to emphasize on some of the highly needed services. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Michael, for those challenges that you've outlined. And I think a lot of the colleagues are nodding their heads in agreement that these are some of the issues that we grapple with. However, we've seen with the COVID-19 pandemic, the response can be coordinated. We can have this intergovernmental coordination and like foresight with our different levels of government and different spheres of government. Pravendra, can you share a bit more of how that was made possible in eThekwini, and how that can be a learning curve for us to work like that and make that the norm instead of resorting to our old ways of doing things? We saw how bringing resources together, coordinating responses can be effective and can accelerate the trajectory to us becoming more responsive and really embedding the SDGs. Can you give us some of the reflections there on how can we make this the norm?
Yeah, thank you, Letamo. It's very difficult in the current context that we find ourselves in. Intergovernmental relations is, I think, the biggest challenge across all municipalities currently. But we were in the fortunate position as being one of the pilots for the district development model. We had sort of institutional mechanisms already set up where the three spheres were actually planning together, were budgeting together, and so forth. So we started to see the fruits of that engagement come through in our implementation moving forward. The district development model provides that opportunity. How you use that opportunity is up to the municipalities. So where do we land ourselves on specific issues, or whether it's catalytic projects, whether it's climate change, and so forth, that needs to be determined and defined by the municipality itself. For us, it was really about coordinating a sort of single plan across those three spheres where we could actually implement together and actually see the benefits. You know, one of the biggest misnomers out there at the moment is that there's a lack of funding. There is funding, it's just not coordinated. And through this process, the district development model and the one plan process, we are starting to coordinate. Let me give you an example. So currently in the eThekwini space, there's over 80 billion Rand worth of investment across all spheres of government. Now, some of that is actually duplicated. Through this process of DDM, we can actually reduce some of that duplication, but also target across. Through that co-creation plan, we have a better opportunity to actually embed the principles as well as the outcomes of the SDGs. So therefore, we see it as an opportunity. But being one of the pilots and having a sort of longer lead time into the process, it worked in our favor in this case. The issue of co-creation is very, very, very important, because we cannot do this alone. And the co-creation is actually across the spheres. It's not only local government, national and provincial, but how do we bring in business as well as your NGOs and your civic society, and I think civil society. And I think Sharon brought up a very, very important point. You know, the COVID has actually shown us how we can build better partnerships. With the businesses, we were able to actually coordinate better social investment opportunities and projects within our areas to actually add benefit to the over and above the services that we provide. You know, with civil society, we actually started creating additional partnerships. Those partnerships actually assist in building relationships. You know, government is all about relationship and how you actually work within those relationships. So from that perspective, we found that co-creation actually assists, but co-planning, co-budgeting, co-implementation is actually the key moving forward. Thank you, Leto. Sorry.
Thank you so much, Pravendra. Moses, welcome back. If you can give us some of the perspectives from your city, from Accra, what have been some of the institutional mechanisms for embedding, but also this critical issue around partnerships and bringing in stakeholders and recognizing that as cities, we don't have the sole responsibility of doing everything in our cities, but bringing in partners is important.
Well, this point is very important. Apologies to everyone for the lost connection there. It happens there and there. We were talking about it. I didn't know it was going to happen to me. It did. Apologies for that. One interesting bit, and I'm excited about this, about SDG, is that it's got linkages with almost all other programs that we run. SDGs had linkages with climate action plans. SDG had linkages with transport systems, with agriculture, with the economy. It has got these linkages like an octopus. It's everywhere. You can find it everywhere. Careful planning of the SDG implementation will ensure that whilst we are able to look deeply into all those areas, we are still able to achieve our SDG targets. And that is very critical. And one of the advantages you do, is talking about co-creation and co-planning, is that when you do that at the stage of the programs themselves, you are able to link up and save substantial funding in terms of where there are duplications. So that is very, 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 very important. And then also, I have to say that having that partnership with civil society, with many other organizations that are into specific areas, whether about climate change, whether in areas of resettling, those who are sleeping rough on the streets, whether it's about economic development, you are able to bring to bear the entire group of people who are needed to ensure that resources are not wasted, resources are well planned, and that we are able to channel our mega resources into useful areas that advance the SDG, as well as advance the life of those that are affected. Let me add this finally before I leave. That SDG is not about jargons. It's not about all these big projects and the stuff that we're thinking about. At the heart of SDG is people, planning to advance the life of people. And it is therefore important that as we coordinate all the work that we are doing, it is focused in improving the wealth, the well-being, and the people within our cities. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for those valuable contributions, Moses. If I may come back to you, Shireen, this issue of civil society organizations coming to the fore and communities standing up and taking a stand around their own well-being, their livelihoods. How can cities be enablers and not hamper these efforts that civil society and communities are making? How can cities be enablers of entrepreneurship? You mentioned some of the initiatives that your city is taking around waste and the economic opportunities around that. Can you elaborate more on the role of cities in becoming enablers for such initiatives?
Well, cities are there to work with civil societies to achieve all kinds of objectives, because the city's resources are not enough, nearly enough to achieve those. Having civil society organizations is an extension of the city's arm to be able to have access to all kinds of resources, ideas, knowledge, actions, to be able to deal with specific problems within our society. So as cities, we welcome civil society groups, and we work with a lot of them. Whether in area of gender improvement, that you could see had happened a lot in Accra. I mean, through collaborations with city, with civil society, we've been able to make significant progress in addressing gender issues. That is very important. Now, when we come to Accra, there are a lot of civil society organizations that are working with deprived women. We call them Kaye. Used to headquarters, they carry goods across Accra when they come to downtown Accra. A lot of them, and they are doing marvelous jobs. The city works with them, the city collaborates with them to ensure that actions are targeted, effective, and that it yields results. And what we also do is that by working with some of these civil-based societies, we give them credibility. We give them the ability to be able to attract certain funding to be able to implement those projects. And we do that. I would also say, before I leave, one interesting aspect, something that is very dear to me, is that at the moment, the city is planning a collaborative approach with a civil society organization to implement ICT-based training in Accra that I find very interesting, because the World Bank report has shown that, I mean, a lot of us don't have knowledge of the use of the computer beyond the basics, and that it is substantial if you are going to advance our ICT ideas, if you are able to use ICT as an anchor to unleash further development, to bring in that additional economic space that is needed to ensure further growth. There is a need to improve on ICT skills. And guess what? It is civil society organizations that is partnering the city to achieve that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for those inputs, Moses. Now going to City of Umhlathuze. Shireen, can you share some of those insights from your city?
Thank you, Ditehoho. I think that cities can play a pivotal role in mainstreaming the work of grassroots movements into the SDGs localization process. And there are various levels in which the support can happen. I think first and foremost, the work being done by civil society organizations, NPOs, etc., needs to be better institutionalized. We are unfortunately in very dynamic environments. Priorities change, political terms change, and so institutionalizing these arrangements become pivotal. And we found memorandum of understanding. It doesn't need to be heavily pinned down by legalities, but something to offer surety to communities that the work that they're achieving doesn't disappear into a dark hole, you know. And so the institutionalizing process is critical. And so that somehow makes its ways into local policies. That's one. Secondly, I believe that there are opportunities in repurposing municipal budgets towards the work being done by these civil society actors. Certainly there are also, we found from our experiences, there are greater opportunities for also gainful employment from these very energized groups of groups of people. So it becomes a useful conduit for job absorption, training programs, and so on. And so we found that there's useful synergy as well from the local economic development programs of training and upskilling with these civil society players. Because I mentioned this previously, all well and good, the work being done, but at some point we also need to graduate the efforts of these participants from recycling to now getting involved into, you know, into mainstream industrial processes. And it needn't have to be at a scale of an industry, but to have a chain of graduating from, you know, an informal economy to something more organized provides much hope for some of these civil society players. The last point is monitoring and tracking this work. At some point, we also need to measure the impact of these civil society groups. Monitoring comes with getting a baseline and then tracking the improvements or the impacts that they've had. And that has to happen at some level. I believe at local government level would be an opportune space to start.
Thank you so much, Shireen. Certainly, monitoring and evaluation is also something that you mentioned, Michael, as some of the challenges that have come up in the cities that you've done research on. So how can cities improve on their data collection, collation, and analysis that will also then help them with monitoring and evaluating the impact of the work that they're doing? Michael?
Thank you so much. Once again, we did identify monitoring and evaluation as a very critical component in tracking the implementation process of the SDGs in various cities that we were dealing with. And each and every city that we are dealing with had some sort of way of undertaking this process. But when we looked at these processes, we realized that internal monitoring and evaluation wasn't as that effective because then we realized that the same officers in government, relevant government departments who were implementing these processes were the same officers who were doing the implementation. And this was not bringing the accuracy that would require. And to some extent, there's a possibility of trying to present information that indicates that some progress is being achieved, while in actual sense, there is very little progress. So this we noted from Shimla in India that had an external monitoring and evaluation mechanism, in which case this was done by an institution which was related to the government, of course, and of course contracted by the government to do this particular work. And this, we realized that was bringing a more accurate information about the progress of the evaluation. And we also noted that in terms of data collection, there is need for bringing the institutions together into some collaboration of working relationship. As we noted that data was scattered in various institutions with various mandates. For example, data on water supply and consumption. This would be found in the department responsible for the water supply within the city setup. And also some health information was also could also be got from the health departments. But what we noted is that at the local level, this could not be brought together. We also noted that at the national level, we have the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics in Kenya, for that matter, and this was bringing information from the local level and consolidating it at the national level. But the challenge was that when it comes to the reporting scale, the city was not coming out as the reporting scale, but the reporting scale was rather wider than the city. And this was not, so it was not reporting issues that could relate to the SDGs, especially SDG number 11. And therefore, in some of our work, we brought the city into collaboration, with officials from the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics. And we noted that there is need to do some extra analysis to break down the information that has been collected at the national level to reflect the face of the city. And this is just strengthening multi-level collaboration and working more on the data to make sure that the analysis is done effectively and the missing data is also collected. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We can go on with this conversation and the insights that we get from each of the cities. Unfortunately, we're almost out of time, but I'd just like to touch on some of the aspects that came out. Pruvendra, you talked about this coordinated action between the different spheres of government and involving other urban actors in how we address and respond to the challenges that we face in cities. And that has come out very nicely through the DDM, the District Development Model approach in eThekwini, but also through the intergovernmental relationships that have been strengthened through that process. You also said that there's lots of money available, so financing is not a problem. It's just how we coordinate that expenditure properly, and the planning that goes into that is quite critical. So thank you for those insights. Moses, you talked extensively about, you know, how the institutionalizing happens in Accra, and how the impact has been felt at the local level in terms of communities and civil society organizations really taking the opportunity to interface well with the city and grab the opportunities that exist, and how livelihoods are being improved, whether it's through the gender-based initiatives or whether it's through the economic aspects of that. And then Shireen around how you know, civil society and entrepreneurial initiatives can be encouraged, and also the fact that we need to upscale those interventions to more meaningful and more formal organized businesses, where people can then really make a living out of these entrepreneurial activities, and not just making it as day-to-day bread issues. And then coming to you, Michael, I like the insights that you've given us around the different perspectives of the cities, and it's across the continents and across different contexts, from India to Malmo in Sweden to our African context, and how some of these challenges can be addressed. And I was thinking now, as Prevendra was talking about financing not being an issue, perhaps in other countries as well, it's just about coordinating and funding the things that would make implementation possible. So if we look at funding the data capacity within cities, if we look at funding and capacitating cities in terms of monitoring and evaluation, some of these implementation challenges can be overcome. So thank you so much for those inputs. I'll now hand over back to Paul, and then we'll give each panelist a parting shot at the end. Thank you so much, everyone. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you so much, Ditabo, for guiding us through a deeper exploration of some of these inputs, and for summarizing that so well. I've been scribbling as we've been talking, and I feel like there could be a really interesting output of an argument for SDG localization in these really fabulous quotes that we've heard today. You know, Prevendra on government is all about relationships, you know, co-budgeting, co-planning, co-implementation. Shireen on how the city, which in my mind we've always known is one of the best levers for implementation because it's closer to the people, but actually taking on an active role as an intermediary in doing the bridging work actively, as opposed to simply being well placed to be an implementer. So I think there are a lot of ingredients that have been put into our meal of a conversation today, and there are many things that can be taken forward. And I think as a closing reflection, 30 seconds from each person, I think, what is one thing that struck you about the conversation today that you might want to take forward? And I don't know, Prevendra, if you have your answer on the backside of your notes of how many indicators you touched, but that could be part of your reflection. I think that would be a nice way to close. And maybe we'll go in reverse order. So Ditabo, what would you take forward? And then Moses, Shireen, Michael, and Prevendra.
For me, it's the possibilities. Thank you.
She's beat you all in 30 seconds. Okay. Moses, what would you take forward in this conversation?
Well, for me, it's the idea that cities are still committed to SDG and are working hard to implement the SDG. In spite of COVID, we can still do more, and we need to continue doing it. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Shireen?
For me, it would be that the leave no one behind catchphrase could be realistically achieved through civil society partnerships, but this too needs to be coordinated.
Yes.
Okay.
Thank you so much. I would just present some sort of a question here. Thank you so much, the organizers of this webinar. And my question is, how can you contribute to bringing African cities facing common challenges, to work together, to understand what they are going through, and also to understand and also present their coping mechanism to each other. African cities facing common challenges, having same opportunities to be working together, sharing ideas and experiences. This can be a learning process, city peer-to-peer learning. Thank you.
Thanks, Michael. And Bhuvendra.
Okay, so I'll take all the time that was saved for all of the other participants. No, but really, colleagues, we really need to start to change the sort of narrative around SDGs in cities. It's moved on from linkages and alignment and so forth. It's actually now talking about embedding, and we need to really get that sort of narrative going with our cities, because it's about authenticity. We really want to make an authentic connection to the SDGs and not create artificial sort of relationships or connections. And that's the message I want to get out to cities. With regards to the answers, it was more than 20, but less than 50. But I'll still leave that to you to find out exactly how many I've actually achieved in terms of the linkages. Paul and colleagues, thank you for the opportunity. It's been a great morning. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I wish to thank our panelists for offering their provocations and their time. I think this has been a really rich discussion. I'd like to thank the organizers of the Sustainability Summit for thinking of us, and most particularly to thank the participants in this webinar discussion. We hope this has been provocative, and we look forward to seeing you in the next conversations. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good day to all.
Bye.
Bye.